A friend stumbled upon this aging relic, a Cyberpower PC from circa 2012 that was actually pretty decent for its day. This is rocking one of the earliest HEDT chipsets, HEDT meaning high-end desktop, as in the extra core, extra IO'd CPUs on an extra expensive motherboard. With this being an X179 board and an i7-3820 CPU. The graphics card though, that's where it's at, a GTX 670. This was, and depending on how you look at it, either the second or technically the third most powerful NVIDIA GPU that they made at the time, with that confusion stemming from the GTX 690, which was just two GTX 680s SLI'd together on a single PCB, but still. The 670 was an impressive card, but together with this i7, how does it fare in 2024? Is it e-waste, or is it still good enough for gaming? Let's find out. The system itself is, at least as far as I know, unchanged from its as-new condition, save for a 512GB SATA SSD that I installed as the hard drives were all removed when my friend got his hands on this. So what's actually in here? Well, a Gigabyte X79UD3 motherboard. That means you have quad channel RAM, albeit only one DIMM per channel on this more budget version of the board of DDR3 RAM. This chip tops out at 64GB of RAM support, although I suspect that this board might be limited to 32GB thanks to it only having 4 DIMMs instead of the full 8 that this socket could have. Either way, you've still got the LGA 2011 socket in the middle, and a shocking 4 PCIe Gen 3 by 16 slots that does indeed support quad SLI and quad crossfire. For those of you who are younger than like 25, by the way, SLI and crossfire was a way to use multiple graphics cards to get more performance. It was mostly terrible, as it almost always had to be supported in the games, of which very few ever properly supported it, and there were also issues like micro-stuttering, so yeah, it wasn't great, but this board supported the top-end 4-card version if you had the money for both this board and 4 cards. The CPU, on the other hand, isn't exactly top-end. It's actually the lowest rung on the X79 ladder. This chip is still just a quad-core. It's a quad-core with 40 PCIe Gen 2 lanes available, but why would you buy one of these over an i7-2700K? I mean, both of them are Sandy Bridge architecture, both of them are quad-core with hyper-threading, so why buy the considerably more expensive one? Well, if you need all those PCIe lanes, quad-channel, double capacity supporting RAM, and 37% more power to throw at the problem. Now, does this gaming PC make use of any of that? No, of course not. But this was at least the idea of that chip and this platform. Anyway, that chip is cooled by what I think is a Corsair H60, which remarkably is still working just fine all these years later. As for RAM, we've got 16GB of DDR3 1600, some real top shelf stuff for the day. In fact, it's actually Kingston HyperX, back when Kingston used to own HyperX. And of course we have that GTX 670. This is a reference card, back when reference cards were still a thing, and used an awful blower style cooler. This was real common, and I'm pretty glad that you basically can't buy blower style cards anymore. You kind of can, but you don't want to. What's more surprising to me though is that this is an NVIDIA branded card. Not just an NVIDIA GPU, but a card made by NVIDIA. Not ASUS, MSI, Gigabyte, EVGA, RIP, or Zotac. This is like in an NVIDIA reference card style. This is an actual NVIDIA card. It's kind of interesting. What's also interesting is all of the empty memory locations. Hypothetically, this card could have had double the VRAM, although you would need a custom VBIOS to make that work, and let's face it, the GPU core isn't worth all that effort. Oh, and we can't forget the case. This bad boy is the Cooler Master CM Storm, which despite its looks does in fact still have an optical drive and 4 more 5.25" drive bays. It also has like maybe 6 or 7, 3.5-inch drive bays inside, although not exactly a huge amount of room for the monster GPUs that we have nowadays. So if that's the system, how does it hold up in 2024? Well, let's start with the CPU. I've included some points of comparison here: a 10th gen lower end i5, the i10400F, a Ryzen 5600X, and the new top end Intel chip, the 13900K. Starting with Cinebench R20 single thread, well, you can see the difference. Even the 10400F, a now 3.5 generation old chip, isn't far off being twice as fast in the single threaded department, and the 13900K is 3.5 times faster. That's pretty impressive, albeit for a 12-year-old gap between them. In multi-threaded, we see the biggest difference, especially thanks to the core count improvements we've seen over the years. While Intel have definitely rested on their laurels for a good decade or so, Sandy Bridge included, well, we do now have higher core count chips on hand. The 10400F, for example, is a 6-core part, which is why it's well over twice as fast as the 3820 in all-core work. The 5600X is another 1,000 points clear, almost the full performance of that chip on its own. And of course the 24-core, in sort of scare quotes there, 13900K is a bit over 11 times faster than the old i7. Interestingly, the efficiency cores in the 13900K are actually faster in both single and multi-threaded work than the old i7. Like, just 4 of the efficiency cores from that i9 are faster than the 3820. That's kind of crazy. Now in Blender, well, it's just bad. The BMW scene took just over a minute to render on the i9, and almost 5 minutes to render on the i5 10400F, or 12 minutes and 38 seconds to render on the 3820. Ouch. What's worse is the Gooseberry render, which took just under 6 minutes on the i9, but took an hour on the 3820. That's how much of a real-world performance difference there is. Of course, the i7 only has a TDP of 130 watts, and in my testing it only drew more like 90 watts compared to the chip-degrading 253 watts of the i9. But still. Of course, you care about gaming results, so let's take a look at those. Testing at 1080p, but on the lowest settings, you can get anywhere from playable, like CS2 over 100 FPS, or Siege at 90 FPS, to pretty naff in Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 43 FPS average, to just downright bad in Cyberpunk at under 30 FPS. Maybe at 720p you'd have a better time on the more intensive games, but with no DirectX 12 support, I had a few issues getting games like Cyberpunk to even run properly. The 670 is definitely showing its age. Of course, in more esports titles like CS2 and Siege, and I'd throw in things like Valor and Dota and LoL in there too, you should still be able to play decently well, if not exactly competitively. For anything more intensive, you're going to struggle. But what if that frankly terrible i7 is holding us back, you know? Maybe the GTX 672GB has some untapped potential that we just need to pair with the right CPU to release. Well, I stuck that 670 in my i5 14600K test rig to find out, and the results might shock you. In CS2, we see 50% more performance. I mean, that's actually pretty huge. We've unlocked a lot of potential there. Let's see if that carries on to the other titles. In Siege, we got, less performance. Yeah, I mean, not by much, it's within margin of error, but it's certainly a tiny bit less. Maybe Shadow of the Tomb Raider will say it in, oh no. No, that's pretty much the same too. Cyberpunk? Nah, that's also the same. Damn, I guess the GTX 672GB doesn't have much potential left to tap. So, is this system e-waste, or is it still good enough for gaming? Well, depending on the game, it's either still just about okay, or well past its use-by date. It's still usable, especially with an SSD as your boot drive, but it's safe to say you won't be playing the latest, most demanding titles at anything other than 720p low, or esports titles at 1080p low. The CPU, remarkably, isn't actually much of a bottleneck for this GPU, although I suspect that anything higher end and you'd be risking it. Surprisingly, the system was perfectly usable. It wasn't horrendously slow, I think it was noticeably slower than a more modern system, but it was still perfectly fine, so if you do want to just use this for basic computing tasks, that's perfectly fine. Equally, this should actually be usable as a pretty decent, if fairly power-hungry, home server. With the, I think, 10 SATA ports this board offers, plus all of that PCIe connectivity, you can easily run a home server with a bunch of networking on this. The only real catches are the maximum RAM capacity and the maximum of 6 cores on this platform if you were to upgrade that CPU, which if you want to run, say, virtual machines and stuff like that, isn't ideal, but I mean, the option is certainly there, and this case is great for storage too. So I don't think this is ready for the scrap pile yet, but it's certainly past its prime for gaming. Of course, those are my thoughts, but I'd love to hear yours in the comments down below. What do you think about using a GTX 670 in 2024, and do you have any use cases for a machine sort of like this? Let me know in the comments. If you want to see more videos like this one, you can hit the subscribe button, turn on the bell notification if you haven't already. You can also check out plenty of other videos on the end cards if you want to stay up to date and check out some of the other stuff, the 1,000 or 2 videos that I have on the channel already. Feel free to take a look. And otherwise, that's kind of it. If you want to support the channel, there are a load of links in the description, including to my very own hardware tools, the open source response time tool and open source latency testing tool. And yeah, otherwise, thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you on the next video.